Chapter 1 Message of the Bells March 1st, 1838. The deep-toned bell of the Basilica of St. Francis sounded the first note of the evening Angelus. From the great square tower, perched on the sloping hillside of Assisi, the swelling wave of sound rolled out across the wide plain of Umbria until it was lost in the distance. And before it had reached the far horizon, another deep note from the bell had started on its way. The narrow, twisted streets filled with music as one by one the bells of Assisi took up the refrain. In turn, they started, and in turn they joined in chorus. The metallic note of St. Rufino's, the sweet mellow chime of St. Clair's, the thin, incredibly ancient tremble of the more distant St. Damian's, all sang together in the cool, calm evening air. Across the wide square in the center of the town, the voices of the bells traveled in mounting waves until they broke in a sparkle of sound against the shuttered windows of the governor's palace. In the shaded room within, Agnes smiled happily in the warm darkness as she recited her evening Angelus and listened to the joyful message of the bells. She turned to clasp her baby son in her arms and savor the joy of holding him pressed to her heart. The weary months of waiting were now over. He was here, beside her, Francis, her 11th child. He had been twice born that day. Scarcely had he opened his eyes to the strange, bright light of a strange new world when they had carried him to the baptismal font in the cathedral to become a child of God. Centuries earlier, St. Francis had been baptized at that very spot. In tribute to his memory, the parents of Assisi had ever since insisted on having their children baptized there too. For more than 600 years, every child born at Assisi had been brought to the baptismal font of St. Rufino's. The officiating priest, Father Joseph Bathory, may have raised his eyebrows a little when he saw the imposing list of names. To be sure, the father was governor of Assisi, but to call the child Francis, Joseph, Vincent, Pacifico, Rufino, surely enough patron saints for one small baby. No one could have guessed that day that he would be known to this world and to the next, and forever in eternity by none of these names. His everlasting name, given to him years later when he entered the Passionist congregation, was to be Gabriel, Gabriel of Our Lady of Sorrows. Is it fanciful to imagine that there was a special note of joy on that day in the many-tongued choirs of the bells, a hidden and secret message that was as joyful as it was glorious and mysterious? Or is it too much to think that a gray-clad figure, wraith-like and unsubstantial, with bearded face and great dark eyes, shining with undoubtable love, may have slipped unseen through the familiar, friendly streets of Assisi that night? He paused to look up at the lighted window of the time-worn old palace, where another little Francis was nestling in his mother's arms, and smiling tenderly, raised his hand in blessing and was gone. Though not accounted wealthy, the Pacenti family was in a very comfortable circumstance. The father, Sante Pacenti, born at Turin in 1789, was a graduate of the University of Perugia, where he had read a brilliant course in law. He had then entered the civil administration of the Papal States in the reign of Pope Pius VII, and at the age of 22 had been appointed superintendent of the government-controlled state Flora Millers at Umbria, a small town in Romagna. Promotion came quickly, and he was soon transferred as governor of chief magistrate to the larger town of Civitovia in the province of Ancora. Here, the handsome young official was naturally a welcome and honored guest at receptions held in the leading homes, and nowhere was he more graciously received than by the socially prominent Frascati family. Soon, Agnes Frascati, then a charming and vivacious girl of 21, was looking forward more than eagerly to the visits of the serious-faced and rather solemn young man, some 12 years her senior. The romance prospered, the parents of Agnes warmly approved, and on May 13, 1823, the young couple were married in the little seaside church of St. Maron. Their marriage appears to have been ideally happy. Year by year, the family grew in numbers. Eventually, there were 9 boys and 4 girls, although 2 had died in infancy. Little Francis Pacenti grew up in the midst of a lively circle of brothers and sisters. Incidentally, he was the first of the children born in Assisi, for owing to many rapid changes of post, Sante Pacenti had not yet been able to establish his home on any permanent basis. Shortly after his marriage, he had been transferred first to San Gimignano, thence to Corilindio, and again to San Gallo, where he arrived in 1829. There was great rejoicing in the little town on March 31st, 1829, when Cardinal Castingi, a native of Cassilia, was elected pope, taking the name of Pope Pius VIII. His reign was very brief, lasting less than 2 years, but Sante Pacenti was grateful when the new Pope Gregory left him undisturbed at his post. For 8 happy years, the Pacenti family lived at Singolio, during which time 6 children were born to them: 3 boys, Aloysius, Michael, and Henry, and 3 girls, Mary, Louise, Therese, and Adele. But in 1837, Sante Pacenti was named governor of Assisi, and again he had to move. Once more, household goods were created for the journey, furniture carefully packaged. The children were wildly excited at the prospect of moving to a new home, and Agnes Pacenti felt especially happy that the immortal city of St. Francis would in future shelter her family. Owing to her delicate health at the time, Agnes was unable to nurse her newborn baby. The infant was therefore entrusted to a kind motherly woman, Teresa Battori, sister of the priest who had baptized him. Little Francis spent the first year of his life at Pretoria, before being brought home to rejoin the rest of the family at Assisi. From what we know of her, Agnes Pacenti appears to have been rather a remarkable person. Her portrait shows a charming oval face with regular features, alert and intelligent. Her hair was dressed high in accordance with the prevailing fashion of the day. Her large dark eyes were clear and expressive, whilst a small sensitive mouth revealed an emotional nature. Her whole expression showed a serene dignity, in which the poise and self-possession of maturity are sweetened by the lingering charm of youth. Her children remembered her with loving gratitude. In quotes, "We were all brought up with the utmost care," one recalled, "for our mother was very devout and reared us carefully according to the precepts of our faith." Despite her household duties and the care of a large family, she found time not only for her ordinary religious duties, but also for mental prayer and meditation. The importance she attached to this is shown by the fact that she had left us points and outlines of meditation which show us an amazing depth and precision of thought, says one of her children. Of the various towns in which they lived, it is likely that Assisi had the greatest appeal for Agnes Pacenti. In Assisi, even today, one still feels the atmosphere of a holy place. The sweet presence of St. Francis pervades the town like an all-embracing perfume. She had only to walk a little way down the hill, past picturesque old balconies, gay with flowers, past the courtyard entrance to the great basilica, which jutted out upon the hillside. And there, before her, was one of the most entrancing views of Italy. The broad plain of Umbria spread itself at her feet. She could see the checkerboard of little fields, green and brown and gold, the graceful olive trees sloping down the hill, the darker green of the pines, the tiny white houses gleaming in the sun, the distant church tower standing straight and slim. Away in the dim distance, far as the eye could see, the great backdrop of the pines framed the scenes before her. Line upon line of mountains, each one higher than the last, the lower slopes a misty gray, and peaks shining with unmelted winter's snow. Below her was the church of the Porta Nuncilia, the little portion where St. Francis had calmly welcomed Sister Death at the close of his life. As she sat there gazing down, it was easy for Agnes Pacenti to recall the memory of the saint's farewell to his beloved city. Very gently, the brethren had carried him through the city gate and down the dusty, windy road that drove to the plain below. Soon they came to a turn in the road, and he spoke to the bearers. "Put me down," he said. And when he had rested a little while, he said again, "Lift me up a little now, turn me to face the city." His poor dim eyes, now almost blind, could no longer see clearly, but he could still discern the white blur that was Assisi, shining in the sun. And Francis blessed the city of his youth, the place forever linked with his name. "Lord God," he prayed, "this was once a godless city, but you have shown favor to it and been merciful indeed. God bless you, sweet city. Many souls have found salvation through you. Many servants of the Most High shall dwell in you. From you, many will be chosen to enter the kingdom of heaven. Peace be to you." The blessing of such a saint is strong and lasting. Who can doubt that it was still fruitful and efficacious some 600 years later, when another Francis, another son of Assisi, was chosen to enter the kingdom of heaven? Inspired by such memories, Agnes Pacenti can hardly have failed to tell her children many of those time-honored tales that still cluster around the name of St. Francis. She told them of the wolf of Gubbio and the first Christmas crib. She told them how, too, St. Francis loved all God's creatures, even the poor outcast lepers, and how the birds came to perch upon his outstretched hands. Pointing to the crucifix, she told them the wonderful story of how St. Francis received on his own body the imprint of the 5 precious wounds of Christ. Her own little Francis, hardly old enough to understand, would have heard the frequent repetition of his patron's name, and in some childlike way, unknown to us, often identified himself with these tales. And because the small mind of a child is plastic and receptive, Francis looked at the large crucifix and wondered. Be that as it may, the association of the Passionist family with Assisi was not of long duration. Having already had several changes of domicile, Sante Passionist learned to his dismay that he was again to be uprooted. On May 14, 1840, he was officially informed of his transfer as governor to Montetallo in the Marche, a move which entailed the temporary breakup of the family. 2 of the children, Teresa and Michael, accompanied their father to Montetallo, while the rest of the young family remained in Assisi with their mother. But they had to move from the governor's residence and vacate the spacious apartments that were urgently required by Sante Passionist's successor. Temporary accommodation was found for them in the Bozzoni Palace, but the arrangement was by no means to their liking, being both awkward and unsuitable. It was heartbreaking for Sante Passionist to be thus separated from his wife and children. He could only manage to see them on quick, hurried visits at irregular intervals. It may be taken for granted that he made his predicament known to the authorities. At all events, another speedy change took place, and much to his relief, Sante Passionist was transferred to Poggi Moretto, a pleasant, friendly little town halfway between Rome and Turin. To his great joy, he was able to bring the whole family together again in April 1841, and here in the following month, Rosa, the last of his children, was born. It was proving more and more difficult for Sante Passionist to reconcile the conflicting demands of his private life and his public office. His wife was now constantly ailing and needed the support and comfort of his presence. His large and lively family obviously required a father's hand to supervise them. He therefore requested Pope Gregory to transfer him finally to a less exacting post, a permanent and stable position that would enable him to devote his leisure hours to his wife and children. The petition was favorably considered, and in due course he was appointed legal assessor to the pontifical delegation of Spoleto. Gratefully he prepared for a final move, and arrived with his family in October 1841. Henceforth this was to be their home, and it was here the young Francis Passionist grew up to youth and to manhood. The simple routine of family life, disturbed by so many rapid changes of abode, was quickly re-established at Spoleto. At the close of the day, family prayers were said together, and Francis, small as he was, learned to kneel with others for the evening rosary, proudly holding his first rosary wreath in his chubby little hands. At his mother's knee, a child as bright and intelligent as Francis quickly learned the simple prayers of childhood, could soon make the sign of the cross with careful attention, and would press to his lips the brightly colored pictures of the Madonna, beloved by children in every Catholic home. When the little ones had been put to bed and peace restored to the household, Sante Passionist and his wife sat side by side in companionable silence, enjoying the comfort of being together again. Sometimes he read aloud to her from a book of her choice, whilst her busy needle flew to and fro on an intricate pattern of colorful embroidery. Her favorite book was that delightful spiritual classic, The Introduction to a Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales. Together, no doubt, as parents do all over the world, they discussed the future and wondered what was in store for their children. Would they have the happiness of vocation in their family? Would one of their boys become a priest? Would one of their girls become a nun? Agnes Passionist certainly hoped so. Vocations were numerous in her family. Her uncle was a canon of Loreto, she had a brother in the Capuchins, and a sister in a convent. Sante Passionist was cautiously optimistic. He could look forward with reasonable confidence to freedom from the cares which had been beset him in the past. Although they were all sorry to leave Assisi, the change to Spoleto seemed to have been a beneficial effect on all the family. His wife's health was improving, the children were growing up strong and healthy. Soon it would be time to think of sending the boys to college. There was no cloud on the horizon, the future seemed bright and assured. His hopes were doomed to disappoint. Before the year was out, Rosa, the last baby, was taken away by death at the age of only 7 months. But worse blows were still to come. A new year dawned bright with promise, and soon Lent was drawing near. Amongst the carnival attractions before Ash Wednesday was a special performance at the theater. A private box had been allocated to Sante Passionist and his wife, and as leading citizens their attendance was expected. On the same day, Adele, a winsome little 9-year-old girl, was taken ill. It did not at first seem very alarming, but Agnes Pasenti, worried on account of her sick child, was torn between her sense of duty and her family affection. However, her absence would be a matter of only a few hours, and the illness did not appear to be very serious. It was a gala occasion, and her husband wished her to go. She went. They were still engrossed in the play when a hurried message arrived from the house. Adele had taken a sudden turn for the worse and was in grave danger. Filled with anxiety, they hurried home, but it was too late. The child had contracted diphtheria, and there was no hope for her. Next day, January 27th, Adele was dead, a victim of the dreadful infection. Agnes Pasenti was inconsolable. Rightly or wrongly, she felt that she had failed in her duty as a mother. Never for an instant could she forget that she had been at the theater whilst her child was dying. Weeping bitterly, she argued endlessly with herself. I couldn't help it. It wasn't my fault. I didn't do it deliberately. I never thought she was so ill. People would have talked if I hadn't gone. It was all to no purpose. Her feeling of guilt could not be appeased. It had become an obsession with her. Her Franciscan confessor was assiduous in his attention, but Agnes Pasenti could find no peace. She was stricken with meningitis and had given up the unequal struggle. She had lost the will to live. Actually, she never rallied from the shock of Adele's sudden death. One by one, the children were called to her sick room, and one by one she pressed them to her breast, kissed them tenderly on the forehead, and said farewell. Her warm tears fell on the cheeks of little Francis, and her arms remained clasped tightly about him until she gently set him down and sent him away. The last sacraments were administered on February 9th, and on the same day, less than 2 weeks after Adele's death, her mother followed her to the grave. Thus, at the tender age of 4, just when he most needed her loving care, Francis found himself motherless. Barely old enough to understand, he ran through the house crying aloud for his mother. "Mamma mia," he sobbed bitterly. "I want my mamma. I want my mamma." All at once he had left behind him the tender world of childhood. A sudden shadow had been cast over the bright days. A sudden coldness had chilled forever the warmth that had surrounded him from birth. His childish tears were quickly dried, but his heart still wet for a mother's love, now denied him. In his loneliness, he turned to his eldest sister, Mary Louise, then only 13 years old. With a wisdom beyond her years, she gently wiped away his tears, soothed his wild grief, and in that grave way the only children know, explained to him that Mamma had gone away a long, long journey and would not be coming back. He mustn't cry any more, she said, because Mamma was very happy. She was with God, in heaven, and she would still look after him, because she could see him quite clearly from heaven. Little Francis looked up vainly day after day to the blue vault above, wondering if he could catch a glimpse of his lost mother. It is so easy for adults to say that children quickly forget. The time is a great healer. But with a strange awareness of the very young, with a clarity of vision known only to the innocent and pure of heart, Francis sadly realized as the days went by that this little world would never be the same. Never, never, never.